Imagine this. You're trapped in a room with no doors, no windows, only mirrors. Each reflection shows a version of yourself, but distorted. One laughs maniacally as you grasp for control. Another trembles, paralyzed by an invisible threat. A third stares back with hollow eyes, whispering, "You've done this to yourself." You press your palms against the glass, desperate to escape. But the harder you push, the tighter the walls close in. The air thins. Your heartbeat thrums in your skull. And then, a sickening realization. You built this room. Every brick of shame, every pane of regret, every lock of fear was laid by your own hands. But why? Why would you imprison yourself? This is not a nightmare. It is the silent architecture of self-sabotage. Consider the addict who drowns in the very substance that scorches their veins. The artist who shreds their masterpiece hours before the gallery opening. The lover who retreats from intimacy, only to ache with loneliness. These are not failures of morality or willpower. They are acts of rebellion against the self, a grotesque ritual performed in the shadows of the psyche. Here lies the paradox. You crave freedom, but cling to chains. You hunger for light, but feed on darkness. The greatest mystery is not how you became trapped, but why you keep choosing the trap. Think of the last time you stood at the threshold of transformation. A promotion, a confession, a leap into the unknown. Recall the nausea that slithered through your gut, the voice that hissed, "Who do you think you are?" You froze, or you fled, or you forged ahead only to trip on an invisible wire, unraveling everything. Society calls this laziness, cowardice, a flaw in character. But what if it's something far more primal, something coded into the marrow of human existence? Let's dissect the evidence. Neurologists will tell you the brain prefers familiar, hells to unfamiliar heavens. It's why trauma survivors often reenact their pain. Psychologists speak of the shadow self, Carl Jung's abyss where rejected fragments of identity plot their revenge. Philosophers like Søren Kierkegaard warned of the dizziness of freedom, the terror that strikes when we peer over the edge of possibility. Yet none of this explains the visceral betrayal you feel when your own mind becomes a saboteur. The betrayal is the clue. There's a fable buried in this ruin. A child grows up in a cage, taught that the lock exists to protect them from monsters. One day, the key appears. The child holds it, trembling. Freedom is a myth, the walls whisper. Out there, you will dissolve. The child believes the lie, not because they're foolish, but because the cage has become a sacred script. To escape would mean rewriting their entire mythology. And myths, once etched into the nervous system, fossilize into reality. You are that child. Your cage is woven from ancestral fears, cultural hypnosis, and the raw biological terror of annihilation. Every time you've choked on unspoken words, silenced your genius, or numbed yourself with distractions, you were obeying an ancient algorithm. Better to be a prisoner of certainty than a wanderer in the wilderness. But here's the fatal flaw. In the code, the algorithm was never yours. It was inherited, downloaded into you through generations of unhealed wounds, societal sirens, and the primal instinct to belong at all costs. So we arrive at the great question, the one that will haunt every corridor of this exploration. What if self-sabotage isn't your enemy, but a warped guardian, desperately trying to save you from a threat you can no longer see? The answer will demand more than psychology. It will require spelunking into the caves of existential philosophy, where lightless truths wait. It will force you to confront how society weaponizes your deepest vulnerabilities, selling you counterfeit selves like cheap costumes. Most crucially, it will ask you to consider that every act of self-destruction is, in fact, a coded message. Scream from the parts of you buried alive. But first you must stand very still in that mirrored room. Breathe into the terror. Let the reflections crack. What happens next will depend on whether you're ready to hear the secret your shadows have been howling all along. You are not sick. You are haunted. The ghost in your machine has many names: shame, fear, inadequacy. But its true face is older than language. To understand self-sabotage, You must first map the underworld where it gestates, a realm where societal myths fuse with biological survival codes, where Nietzsche's abyss stares back, and where every choice you believe you're making is rigged by forces you've never named. Let's begin with a myth. Plato's cave, the allegory of prisoners chained since birth, mistaking shadows on a wall for reality. What Plato didn't say is that the prisoners eventually fall in love with their chains. They compose hymns to the flickering illusions. They invent gods to explain the shackles. They punish anyone who dares suggest there's sunlight beyond the cave. Why? Because the chains, for all their cruelty, give the illusion of order. To abandon them would mean facing the vertigo of an unmapped world. This is your psyche's default state. A cave within a cave. Jung called it the shadow, the psychic dumping ground where we exile traits deemed unacceptable by our tribes. The perfectionist buries her laziness there. The saint entombs his rage, but the shadow does not rot quietly. It metastasizes. It puppeteers your decisions through proxies, sudden outbursts, paralyzing indecision, compulsive failures. When you sabotage yourself, you're not acting against your values. You're enacting a ritual to appease the exiled selves howling for recognition. Society, of course, thrives on this fragmentation. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World wasn't a dystopia. It was a blueprint. Modernity runs on your self-sabotage. Consumerism needs your insecurity to sell solutions. Social media algorithms monetize your fractured attention. Even education systems condition you to seek external validation over inner truth. You're taught to amputate parts of yourself to fit into prefabricated identities, worker, spouse, citizen, while the soul's wildness is pathologized as mental illness or eccentricity. But the rot goes deeper. Friedrich Nietzsche, that prophet of psychological warfare, diagnosed humanity's core sickness as resentment, a festering hatred of life itself, born from millennia of being told our instincts are sinful, our desires dangerous. Religion, morality, even Enlightenment ideals became tools to turn humans against their own vitality. Bad conscience, he wrote, is the gravest illness that has yet been laid on humanity. The result? A species that punishes itself for existing. Consider the addict again. Society condemns them as weak, but Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, saw addiction as a misguided search for meaning. When the world denies you transcendence, numbness becomes a sacrament. The alcoholic doesn't crave the bottle. They crave annihilation of the self that feels unworthy of love. Similarly, the workaholic grinding themselves to dust isn't ambitious. They're trying to outrun the void where their purpose should be. Here's the fatal equation. Self-sabotage, a loyalty oath to old survival scripts. Your nervous system is a palimpsest, etched with ancestral trauma. A child raised by emotionally absent parents learns to mute their needs, a brilliant adaptation for survival. But decades later, when that child becomes an adult choking back, tears in a therapist's office, the same strategy becomes a prison. Jean-Paul Sartre called this bad faith, the lie we live when we deny our freedom to choose, clinging to roles that crush us because authenticity feels too costly. But what if the cost of not sabotaging yourself is higher? Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher of pessimism, argued that humans are torn between the will to live and the will to die, a primal tug of war between creation and destruction. Modern neuroscience echoes this. The brain's default mode network, responsible for self-referential thought, is a factory of catastrophizing. It simulates disasters to keep you safe, hijacking your present moment to rehearse tragedies that never come. In essence, your mind would rather you fail predictably than risk the existential quake of success. Now the trap reveals its fangs. Every time you sabotage yourself, you're obeying a commandment from the past. Do not outshine your father. Do not want more than your mother allowed herself. Do not rise higher than your ancestors' trauma. These are the invisible loyalties that bind you. What family therapist Ivan Boser-Menyanagi called invisible family scripts. You don't choose them, you inherit them, like a cursed heirloom. Even biology conspires against you. The polyvagal theory explains how trauma lodges in the body, reducing your window of tolerance for stress. When triggered, you regress to fight, flight, or freeze, states where higher cognition shuts down. In those moments, you're not a rational actor but a scared animal reenacting ancient survival plays. The overeater isn't lacking discipline. They're trying to soothe a nervous system stuck in 1943, when their grandmother starved in a war. But the most insidious force is one you've yet to name: the fear of your own greatness. Marianne Williamson famously wrote, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure." This isn't inspiration. It's a bone-chilling truth. To fully inhabit your potential is to become a heretic against everything that told you to stay small. It means risking rejection, loss, and the terrifying responsibility of authorship over your life. So you negotiate. You create leaky ceilings. You accidentally miss deadlines. For dream opportunities, you pick fights with lovers who see your light. Each act of self-sabotage is a burnt offering to the gods of mediocrity, a plea to remain invisible enough to belong, to survive. But survival is not the same as aliveness. The German word Sehnsucht captures this, an inconsolable longing for a life you've never lived. It's the ghost limb of your unmade choices, the echo of the person you could have been. Philosophers argue this ache is the core of human existence. Kierkegaard called it the sickness unto death, the despair of being unable to become oneself. Yet in this despair lies your redemption, for buried in the machinery of self-sabotage is a clue so luminous it could blind you. Your defiance is proportional to your calling. The louder the voice warning you to quit, the more sacred the path ahead. The German poet Rilke understood this when he commanded, "Do not fear the strangeness you feel. The future must enter you long before it happens." But how do you exorcise a ghost that wears your face? The answer lies in a forbidden truth. One that will force you to dismantle the architecture of your identity. You are a prisoner, but the bars are made of air. Imagine living inside a silent film where every frame is tinted with a lie you've forgotten you agreed to. You move through days heavy with unspoken rules. Don't stand out. Don't want too much. Don't trust the part of you that hums with hunger. This is the consequence of self-sabotage, not chaos, but a suffocating order. A life reduced to rituals of avoidance where the real tragedy isn't what you do, but what you allow to remain undone. The brain is a conspirator in this quiet coup. Neuroplasticity, the very mechanism that could liberate you, becomes a jailer. Each time you retreat from risk, neural pathways thicken like scar tissue, wiring you to repeat the past. Negativity bias, an evolutionary relic, hijacks your attention, filtering the world through a lens of threat. A single criticism eclipses 10 praises. A momentary failure fossilizes into identity. "I'm just someone who chokes under pressure," you shrug, unaware that the brain hears this not as confession but as command. But the mind's betrayal pales next to culture's complicity. Heidegger warned of das Man, the they-self, the faceless collective that dictates how to live, what to fear, who to be. You feel it in the hollow cheer of advertisements selling self-worth as a product, in the algorithmic whispers of social media, partitioning your attention into dopamine slots, in the corporate liturgy of hustle culture, which pathologizes rest as laziness and self-worth as a metric of productivity. Society thrives on your self-doubt. Entire industries are built on the carcass of your unmet potential. Consider the Stockholm Syndrome of the soul. You cling to relationships that shrink you, jobs that drain you, routines that numb you, not out of love but because the known feels safer than the terror of aliveness. Cognitive dissonance becomes a survival tactic. If I stay miserable, at least I'm in control. Psychologists call this learned helplessness, but it's more akin to metaphysical surrender. The French philosopher Gaston Bachelard wrote, "One must always maintain one's connection to the past and yet ceaselessly pull away from it." Yet you've done the opposite, severed connection to your deepest desires while chaining yourself to inherited fears. The body keeps score too. Chronic stress from self-abandonment manifests as insomnia, autoimmune flare-ups, the leaden fatigue that no sleep cures. Dr. Gabor Mate, a physician specializing in trauma, argues that many physical diseases are biographies written in flesh, the body's rebellion against a life half-lived. Migraines pound out the rhythm of repressed creativity. Anxiety becomes a perverse prayer. Let me stay small enough to be safe. On a societal scale, the cost is apocalyptic. For every genius who silences their ideas, humanity loses a potential cure, a masterpiece, a revolution. Systems of oppression rely on mass self-sabotage, the internalized belief that change is impossible. Why else would billions endure exploitation, environmental collapse, or soul-crushing work? The greatest trick capitalism ever pulled wasn't convincing people to love their chains. It was convincing them the chains are natural, that the itch of existential hunger can be scratched by consumption. That numbness is peace. Even spirituality is co-opted. The Zen mantra, "Be here now," becomes an excuse to avoid ambition. Gratitude practice morphs into toxic positivity, silencing valid rage at injustice. You're told to manifest your desires while systemic forces, racism, patriarchy, classism, are erased from the equation. The result? A gaslit generation, blaming themselves for societal traps they didn't design. But the most insidious consequence is ontological erosion, the gradual annihilation of your authentic self. Carl Rogers called it the conditions of worth, the lies you absorb about what makes you deserving of love. With every act of self-sabotage, you sand down your edges to fit templates not meant for you. Over decades, the soul's architecture collapses. You become a haunted house, echoes of laughter in empty rooms, footsteps of abandoned selves in the attic. This is how civilizations decay, not with bombs, but with 1,000,000 daily surrenders. The poet David Whyte writes, "The price of our vitality is the sum of all our fears. What have we paid? Art reduced to content, relationships flattened to transactions, leadership replaced by performative narcissism. All while the planet burns and the marginalized scream, because collectively, we've conflated safety with slavery to the status quo. Yet here's the twist that terrifies the powers that never were. Your despair is evidence of your divinity. That ache for more? It's not greed. It's the echo of your unlived life. The panic before a breakthrough isn't a warning. It's labor pains." Rilke again. Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act, just once, with beauty and courage. But courage requires something you've been taught to despise: vulnerability. Not the saccharine kind peddled by self-help, but the violent vulnerability of the Icarus who chooses to fly knowing the wax might melt, of the addict who sits raw-eyed in their first AA meeting, of the CEO who quits to become a teacher. Vulnerability is the antidote to the soul's Stockholm syndrome, but it demands a dismantling of the lies you've mistaken for armor. So the question isn't how do I stop sabotaging myself, but what world might I build if I dared to want what I truly want? The answer waits in the storm eye of your rage, your longing, your most forbidden dreams. But beware. To enter that eye is to surrender every story you've ever told about who you are. You've been taught that freedom is something to seize, but what if it's something you must become? Picture this: a seed buried in frozen soil. It knows nothing of spring, only the suffocating dark. One day, a crack, a splinter of light. The seed doesn't decide to grow. It ruptures. It splits its own body, pushing through decaying husks of its past selves. This is not choice. It's a biological revolt against stagnation. You are that seed. Your rebellion begins not with grand gestures but with the cellular courage to break what's already broken. History's greatest liberators understood this alchemy. Nietzsche, raving prophet of the Übermensch, didn't preach positivity. He demanded amor fati, the love of fate. Become what you are, he thundered. Not an affirmation, but a death sentence to the false self. Van Gogh didn't paint sunflowers. He slashed through the gray fog of Victorian conformity with color so violent, it made society's lies bleed. Frida Kahlo turned her broken body into a manifesto of defiant survival. Each of them did the unthinkable. They weaponized their wounds. Here's the secret your captors never wanted you to know. The prison is the key. Every act of self-sabotage holds a clue to your liberation, written in the ink of paradox. The anxiety. That crushes you? It's a compass pointing to what you care about most deeply. The procrastination that shames you? A strike against work that degrades your soul. The addiction that numbs you? A distorted prayer for transcendence. Your task isn't to eliminate these flaws, but to decrypt them. Begin with the body. Neuroscientist Candace Pert proved emotions are stored as peptides in cellular tissue, meaning your physical form is a living biography of every no you've swallowed, every yes you've choked back. To rebel, you must become an archaeologist of your own flesh. When panic claws your throat, ask, what truth am I gagging on? When inertia pins you to bed, demand, what life is this exhaustion protecting me from? The answers will feel like blasphemy. Good. All revolutions begin with heresy. Now weaponize cognitive dissonance. The Soviet dissidents who toppled empires did it by clinging to contradictions. They'd post signs saying, there is no censorship in censored newspapers, forcing the system to expose its own lies. Do the same. When your mind hisses, you're not ready, write the novel anyway. When your heart pounds, they'll reject you. Confess your love. Let the tension between who you are and who you've pretended to be become unbearable. Crisis precedes metamorphosis, but be warned, this path demands ruthless discernment. Not all parts of you want freedom. Jung's shadow isn't just trauma. It's also the seductive voice that whispers, you've suffered enough. Settle for crumbs. To distinguish allies from saboteurs, use this litmus test. Does this thought expand or contract my life force? Does this habit connect or separate me from my longing? Society will retaliate. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, survivors found feudal systems collapsing, peasants realizing their power. The aristocracy responded with witch hunts. Expect modern equivalents. Friends may pathologize your awakening as midlife crisis. Partners might sabotage your growth to protect their own unhealed wounds. The system will dangle promotions, mortgages, and Xanax to lure you back into the cage. This is when most rebellions die. Not from external force, but from internalized doubt. Here's how to outwit them. Steal fire. Like Prometheus, every day, claim one forbidden pleasure, a 3 p.m. dance break, a political opinion you've muted, 20 minutes of daydreaming. These are not indulgences, but acts of psychological insurgency. As Foucault knew, pleasure is revolutionary in a world that profits from your alienation. Practice sacred betrayal. Your loyalty to family legacies of suffering ends now. Light a candle for the ancestors who survived so you could thrive, then vow, I will not make a shrine of their pain. If your father's criticism lives in your head, write him a letter you'll never send. I refuse to inherit your fear. Burn it. Let the ash fertilize new soil. Hijack the death drive. Freud's Thanatos, the urge toward destruction, isn't your enemy. Redirect it. Instead of binge drinking, binge create. Channel self-destructive impulses into destroying limiting beliefs. Tattoo roomies destroy your house. I'll help you build a new one on your psyche. Become a double agent. The Japanese art of kintsugi repairs broken pottery with gold, honoring breaks as part of history. Infiltrate your own conditioning this way. When attending a soul-crushing family dinner, silently note manipulative patterns like an anthropologist. Smile while mentally composing your memoir. History's greatest escape artists mastered this. Viktor Frankl in Auschwitz realized the Nazis controlled his body but not his mind, so he mentally composed lectures on logotherapy. Harriet Tubman weaponized narcolepsy caused by brain injury, using sudden collapses to avoid detection while liberating slaves. Your perceived weaknesses are secret passageways. But true rebellion requires communion with madness, not psychosis, but the sacred madness that defies rational oppression. Astronomer Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake for claiming infinite worlds existed, screamed at his executioners, "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence with greater fear than I receive. This is the lunatic joy you must cultivate, the knowledge that no cage can hold the part of you that's already free." Still, the final barrier remains: you. The day you stop sabotaging yourself will feel like grief. You'll mourn the familiar ache of playing small. You'll shiver in the vertigo of unmapped potential. This is when most crawl back to their chains. Don't. Instead, do what the mystics did. Reinterpret the myth. The Christian cross wasn't just torture device, it became a symbol of resurrection. Your failures, too, are holy geometry. That time you got fired? The universe firing you from misalignment. The relationship that imploded. A demolition of false intimacy. The addiction that nearly killed you. A merciful curriculum in self-forgiveness. Now the ultimate heresy. Your self-sabotage was never the problem. It was the path. Like the biblical Job, whose faith deepened only after losing everything, your darkest nights have been initiations. The mirrors in that endless room from part 1? They weren't mocking you, they were mapping you. Each fragmented reflection a piece of the divine hologram you're meant to integrate. But integration is not the end. It's the detonator. When Einstein faced contradictions in his equations, he didn't abandon them. He followed them to relativity's door. Your contradictions hold similar power. The part of you that wants stability and adventure, that craves love and fear's engulfment. These aren't flaws, they're event horizons. Stand in their tension until a new physics of being emerges. The rebellion culminates in a single realization. You cannot escape the maze by running, only by realizing you are the maze. And the moment this truth sears you, stone becomes liquid. Walls curve into bridges. Every trap reveals itself as training ground for the life awaiting your courage. But this is merely prelude. The final truth, the one that reconfigures reality, is still coiled in the shadows. It demands we confront, not just how we've been imprisoned, but why we were born to shatter prisons. The lie was so beautiful you mistook it for salvation. You are separate, separate from your pain, separate from your past, separate from the clerk who rings up your groceries, the star collapsing in another galaxy, the version of you that laughs in a parallel life where you didn't stay. This illusion of separation is the root of all self-sabotage, the reason you've warred against yourself like a nation divided. But here, in the ashes of every burned bridge you've built between your parts blazes the final truth. There is no self to sabotage. There is only a symphony of selves, and you are the conductor. Let's return to that mirrored room. The walls aren't closing in, they're multiplying. The laughing demon, the trembling child, the hollow-eyed judge. They step through the glass. Instead of recoiling, you open your arms. The demon's cackle softens into the giddy laughter of a child who's played too long in the sun. The judge's condemnation crumbles, revealing the raw plea beneath. "I just wanted to keep you safe." The child's tears? They're not yours. They belong to your great-grandmother, who buried her dreams in unmarked graves. You've been hosting a funeral for someone else's grief. This is the alchemy no one tells you. Integration isn't about fixing. It's about facing. Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming a whole and at the same time, a part. Not healed, but wholly. Not perfect, but complete. The Japanese concept of wabi-sabi honors beauty and brokenness, but this goes further. Your fractures are how the light of the infinite enters. Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, the idea that we'll relive every moment infinitely, takes on new meaning here. If you had to repeat this life forever, would you choose the same battles? Or would you finally drop the weapons and ask your demons to dance? The answer reveals your ultimate loyalty, to the mask or to the mystery beneath. Consider the quantum paradox. Particles exist in superposition until observed. You've been both observer and observed, jailer and prisoner. But what if all possibilities of you exist simultaneously? The addict and the saint, the coward and the hero, and your only task is to choose which version to feed with your attention. This isn't metaphysics. It's the neurology of neuroplasticity. The self you focus on becomes the self that solidifies. Viktor Frankl's logotherapy rings through. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose. But the ultimate truth widens that space into a cathedral. You are not choosing between good and bad, courage and fear. You're choosing between worlds. Every micro-resistance to self-sabotage births a parallel reality where you exist as your unbound self. Here's the secret the mystics died for. Your suffering was never personal. It was cosmic, a blacksmith's fire hammering you into a vessel wide enough to hold divinity. The Christian mystics called this theosis. The Buddhists name it anatta, non-self. The physicists whisper it as quantum entanglement. All point to the same unbearable truth. You are the universe experiencing itself through human skin. So when you sabotage yourself, you're not failing, you're practicing. Rehearsing for the moment you'll shatter the fourth wall of existence. The alcoholic's relapse, the artist's self-doubt, the lover's retreat. Each is a fractal of the universal ache to return to oneness. Even your darkest acts are love letters to the infinite, written in the ink of desperation. But this is where the path forks. You can keep romanticizing your pain, or you can let it initiate you. The Gnostic Gospels describe Christ's crucifixion, not as tragedy, but as voluntary dissolution into light. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. Your self-sabotage is the unbrought forth howling to be born. The rebellion's final stage is annihilation, not of self, but of the illusion that you were ever alone in this. When Rumi wrote, "You are not a drop in the ocean, you are the entire ocean in a drop," he was giving tactical advice. Your anxiety about the presentation? It's the same energy that spins planets. Your procrastination? A microcosm of entropies, dance with creation. You've been mistaking universal forces for personal failures. Now the ultimate inversion. What if you're not sabotaging yourself, but sabotaging the illusion of yourself? Every time you crash into your limits, you're carving an exit route. The existential philosopher Karl Jaspers called these boundary situations moments of collapse, death, suffering, guilt, that, if fully faced, catapult us into the transcendent. Your rock bottom isn't an end, it's a secret door. This explains history's greatest enigma. Why do those who've suffered most radiate unshakable joy? Holocaust survivors like Edith Eger dancing at 90. Mandela emerging from 27 years in prison speaking of forgiveness. They didn't transcend their pain, they let it transmute them. As Khalil Gibran wrote, "The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain." Your turn. The script flips. That time you betrayed yourself? It was your soul's hunger strike against a life too small. The addiction. A misguided quest for the sacred. The chronic indecision. Proof of your vastness. You contain multitudes, Whitman was right. Even now your resistance to this truth is sacred. The part that scoffs, "This is nonsense," is the same part that once kept you alive by clinging to concrete reality. Thank you. It. Then ask, what if nonsense is the mother tongue of liberation? Here's the final koan. You are both the prison and the key because you are neither. The self is a verb, not a noun, a flickering flame fed by every choice, memory, and unlived dream. When you stop trying to fix yourself and start participating in yourself, the game changes. Quantum physics meets ancient alchemy. Observe yourself with ruthless compassion, and you collapse the wave function of your potential into a new reality. Schopenhauer's will morphs into choice. Sartre's bad faith shatters into radical responsibility. Jung's shadow becomes your co-creator. The mirrors in that endless room? They were never walls. They were portals, each reflection a parallel self, whispering across dimensions. I became a painter in this timeline. I stayed and fought here. In this one, I learned to love the parts you still hide. Your agony came from believing you had to choose one. The truth? You're the sum of all possible yous. The best version of yourself is a trap. The truest version is the one holding paradox. So let's rewrite the myth. You are not Icarus falling. You are the sun that melted his wings, not to punish, but to baptize. What drowned him was not the sea, but his belief in gravity. Now the ultimate instruction: become the heretic of your own life. Burn the scripture of should. Worship at the altar of what is. Let your contradictions be the communion wine. When fear arises, kneel and ask, what frontier of my soul does this guard? When joy comes, let it scorch you. Stop seeking purpose. You are purpose incarnate, a cellular rebellion against entropy. The poet Mary Oliver asked, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" The answer has always been in your sabotage. This breath, this rupture, this unbearable becoming. The mirrors were never the point, you are.